Good evening. I know we're still expecting a few people to come in, but we'll go ahead and get started. At the heart of democracy is the right to vote. As Americans, we have fought for that right throughout our history. The revolutionary cries of no taxation without representation could be heard in the Boston Harbor in 1765, well before the Boston Tea Party. The success of the women's suffrage movement was confirmed with the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote 100 years ago next week. While Blacks were granted the right to vote by the 15th Amendment in 1870, those rights were significantly limited by the Jim Crow laws and other restrictions until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And still, major barriers to voting exist today in America. Voter turnout remains low, with only approximately 60% of Americans voting in presidential elections and only 40% in most recent midterm elections. COVID-19 will exacerbate the challenges of voter turnout in the 2020 election. That is why we chose to bring you this voting rights panel as our first session in a three-part series on current issues that are impacting our nation. Our panelists today are Erika Anthony, co-founder Cleveland Votes, a nonpartisan democracy-building organization. Steve Dettelbach, partner, BakerHostetler, and former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. Jeremy Paris, principal, the Raben Group, a national public affairs and strategic communications firm. And I am Brad Schlang, chair of the Government Relations Committee at the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, and I have the honor of moderating this incredible panel who need no moderation. It's often been said, never discuss politics or religion in polite company. So it is quite ironic that the Jewish Federation is holding an event on voting. But all kidding aside, the Federation is committed to offering opportunities like this one to learn more about important and sometimes controversial issues facing our society. Recognizing that complex issues generate an array of responses, we are also absolutely committed to maintaining a nonpartisan approach to these events. We will look to our panel and to our attendees to help us to realize that goal this evening. I'd like to introduce each of our panelists and give them a chance to share their background and create some framework for tonight's discussion. If I could ask each of you to keep your introductions to about 3 to 5 minutes. First, Erika Anthony. Erika was described by Cleveland.com as a, quote, a potent behind-the-scenes force for equitable democracy. And then my favorite part, Erika Anthony eats obstacles for lunch. Could be the best quote ever. Erika is the executive director of the Ohio Transformation Fund, a collaborative fund developed by national and local funders advocating for healthy communities and an equitable democracy across Ohio. Erika is also the co-founder of Cleveland Votes. So Erika, if you will please tell us about Cleveland Votes and the work that you're doing in the community.
Sure, most certainly. Well, good evening, everyone. Really excited and honored to be a part of this conversation this evening. Really thank the Jewish Federation for the invitation. And I'm ready to cut the rug with my co-panelists here. I think we're gonna have a good time this evening. As Brad indicated, I have the great fortune of being the co-founder to Cleveland Votes along with Crystal Bryant back in 2014. We are joined in the last couple of years by two amazing democracy builders, Jennifer Lumpkin and Devontae Dickey, who lead this work on a daily basis here in the Cleveland area. Cleveland Votes is a nonpartisan democracy building and mobilization entity that aims to strengthen civic muscle and power to ensure we have a more informed, participatory, and cohesive community. So what does that actually mean? For us at Cleveland Votes, we're committed to really shifting power and agency to historically disenfranchised communities or marginalized communities. We aim to advance equitable civic engagement and really try to understand ways that we can tactfully engage the members of our community in a way that is impacting change. We also work really closely with nonprofits, as well as public and private stakeholders to help them really think about how they can leverage their respective platforms and engage their respective constituencies. We have a couple of core roles. We do serve as a funder, so we have the ability to provide grants to nonprofit organizations who are engaging in an array of equitable civic engagement activities. So everything from voter education to mobilization. Over the last year and a half, we've been actively engaged ourselves as well as partners along with Census and Get Out the Vote, voting rights, mobilization. So really anything that falls under engaging our community, we can provide funding for. We also serve as an educator and a trainer, really understanding that, we're all coming at this from different perspectives, different understanding. We are a C3, so we're providing nonpartisan information to ensure, again, that our community feels informed and they know how to show up and where to show up. We also serve as a convener. We work at the intersection, like I said, with nonprofits, but even within nonprofits, working in specific geographies like CDCs, Community Development Corporations across the city of Cleveland, issue-specific organizations like the Ohio Environmental Council, and then more culturally responsive, Young Latino Network, OPAL. There's a host of organizations that we work with. We jokingly say that we often act as the Chuck Woolery for democracy building and creating democracy connections across the city and really helping organizations and individuals understand how they can leverage their respective assets and amplify their work together. And then we have a host of, I would say, one-off projects and working with different organizations and really trying to meet their needs and support their ways of advancing equitable civic engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. And you said that you're looking forward to cutting the rug with your co-panelists. So your next dance partner is Steve Dettelbach. And now Steve has run for public office, so much has been said about Steve, and some of it has been complimentary. But when Steve was awaiting his nomination by President Obama to serve as U.S. Attorney, he was in contention with his friend and former law partner who recognized Steve's commitment when he said, quote, "When I'm watching a Cavs game and drinking a beer, Steve's watching C-SPAN." Steve, you've had such a great impact on the future of Cleveland when you helped negotiate the 2015 consent decree to reform the Cleveland Police Department. Can you provide a brief history of voting rights, voter suppression, and access to the vote in Cleveland?
Sure. First of all, thank you to the Federation, to AJC, to the Maltz Museum. And it's great to be on this panel, Brad, with two incredible other panelists. So I'm going to do this the low-tech way. I'm using my phone. I'm going to show you all a picture of something. Okay, do you see that picture?
Yeah.
I want to ask panelists, so, well, not the panelists, I'll just ask everybody in your own mind, take a second and tell me if you know who's in that picture and what's being shown there. And then I'll tell you what's going on there. So this is a picture that was taken in 1964 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And it's a picture of Rabbi Arthur Lalieveld, the former head rabbi at Fairmount Temple. This is the man who bar mitzvahed me. He's the one who presided over my bar mitzvah. And Arthur Lalieveld had gone down into the South in Freedom Summer and then went back the next summer in 1965 to Selma to fight for, with so many other great people, including John Lewis, the right to vote. It is, as Brad said, the most important right that underpins our entire democracy. And for the 50 years past, since that year, since 1965, 1966, 1967, for the next 40, 50 years, we saw a systematic and bipartisan attempt, because this is not a partisan issue, to try and lower barriers for individuals to vote in this country. And it was, to me, the most important. So that's what's going on in 1979 when I was bar mitzvahed by Rabbi Lullyveld. But unfortunately, in more recent years, we have seen a regression. And instead of seeing elimination of the barriers, we have seen new obstacles that have been erected to the right to vote. Erika, I love that quote about you, that you eat obstacles for lunch, but unfortunately, you've had a lot to digest recently. As obstacle after obstacle after obstacle have been erected in Ohio and elsewhere involving the right to vote. So many people have been on the other side trying to make this happen. Again, it's been a very bipartisan situation, but for me, when you talked about the consent decree, more apropos of tonight's conversation, I was very proud that as the U.S. Attorney, we were able to procure in Cuyahoga County a bilingual ballot, so that Cuyahoga County at long last was in compliance with the requirements of the Voting Rights Act. But like everything in the voting rights area, things are harder than they should be. And we face incredible obstacles ahead. Obstacles relating to increased barriers to register to vote, increased barriers to get absentee votes. I didn't even call it absentee voting, I call it voting at home. Increased barriers to that. And then increased barriers on election day to actually cast a ballot. And I would suggest to everybody here that regardless of who a person votes for, we should all be unanimously opposed to those kinds of barriers. It doesn't do anybody and it doesn't do us any good when we have ID requirements that are there for a problem that doesn't exist. It doesn't do anybody any good when we have fees to request ballots that are there for nobody's good. It doesn't do anybody any good when we restrict the rights of particular counties to send out absentee or vote at home ballots. It doesn't do anybody any good when we can track the number of places that people can go to vote on election day. And these are all things we should unanimously, and as a huge consensus, and the Federation has taken, I think, really great action in this regard, stand up and try to roll back. 50 years after that picture I showed you was taken, I got to stand at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis and my boss then, President Obama, and President Bush, and listen to people talk about what was fought for and what we need to be protected on that day in 1965. And they talked about all these things, but something also sticks with me that President Obama said that day. He said, there are these obstacles and barriers to voting, but a lot of it is also on us. It's on us. We have lower voter participation than many other Western democracies. And I remember he said this in his speech that day in Selma. He said, imagine just one election, just one, where everybody who was eligible voted. What would that look like? And what would our democracy be like? And that's on us. So the two things I think that I can sort of say is, number one, everybody needs to vote. Everybody needs to vote. And we need to tell everybody that. There's no excuse for not voting. People died for that right. And second, if you wanted to do one thing to honor the tradition of Rabbi Lullyveld, I'm not asking you to go down to Hattiesburg and get your skull cracked in like he did, like John Lewis did in Selma. But how about becoming a poll worker? It's a reasonable and reasonably invasive step for people to come and work the polls. You're going to hear about the challenges we're facing in the time of COVID. And for young people, especially out there, it's a real concrete way that you can honor the tradition of so many who have come before us here and try to protect that sacred right.
Steve, we gave you an impossible task to cover 100 years worth of history in 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and you did it beautifully. Thank you. And our final panelist is Jeremy Paris. Jeremy has absolutely lived democracy, serving in roles in Washington, including work related to the nominations of Supreme Court Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. So my favorite Jeremy Paris quote actually comes from Jeremy himself when he said, quote, "What I love is taking a bet on Cleveland." He showed that when he helped redesign Public Square into the beautiful community space it has become today. And most recently, Jeremy chaired the Federation Task Force to examine voting rights in light of the current pandemic. Jeremy, can you report on the findings and the recommendations of your task force?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today. And I got to say, I was ready for this panel, and then all of a sudden, hearing Erika and Steve, it's imposter syndrome sits in. If Erika eats obstacles for lunch, I think Erika and Steve eat injustice for dinner, and have both lived their values in such a profound way. And I am grateful. So I'm grateful to be here today. I'll just do one contextual note that I do want to talk about the important work that our task force did at the Federation has embraced, and what an important step it is. Steve mentioned that President Bush was also at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think it was for probably an anniversary of Bloody Sunday with the late great John Lewis, who's a personal hero of my wife Katie's too. And he mentioned President Bush, and President Bush signed the Voting Rights Act reauthorization into law in 2006. It was a reauthorization that every senator voted for, Republican or Democratic, that the Republican-controlled House of Representatives in 2006 voted for almost unanimously, and President Bush signed into law. Things have been tougher since, but there is this core of democracy and this aspiration for a better America and for a more inclusive America that I think is really true to our values as Jews, speaking for myself, our values in our community. And so I think that it was no accident that President Bush was there. Let me just talk a little bit about the task force and how it fits into what we're doing today. I was asked to do this by the Community Relations Committee to do a nonpartisan task force to look particularly at the challenges to voting during the pandemic. The role of our task force was certainly took in and looked at voting generally and participation generally, but it was really focused on, okay, the pandemic poses a unique challenge to voting that needs a policy response. And how can we get there? And we did this work over a couple of weeks, and we had sort of core guiding principles. One, we wanted voting to be as accessible to the community during the pandemic as it would be were there no pandemic. Two, it needed to be grounded in our Jewish values. And I think that was at the core of the work that we were doing. And Steve has articulated, I think, a good notion of those values as well. And three, that people should not have to make a choice between their health and the ability to exercise the right to vote. So, and then we had a bunch of policy recommendations that came from that we unanimously adopted a policy at the Community Relations Committee. The Federation adopted it, and it is a platform for both advocacy efforts. We have submitted testimony to the Ohio Senate as they're considering some bills related to voting for advocacy efforts to the public. We are able to talk about it and able to form partnerships with other members of the community. A couple of key things to focus on. I'm sure we'll have questions about this. Voting, normally voting registration is a really important part of the process for the right to vote. You have to be registered at your current address to be able to vote. And by the way, it feels silly to tell us, looking at the list of attendees, these are people I've worked with and known forever. I feel like they could be telling me this stuff, I could be telling them this stuff, but here we are. And so if communities that move more often, which is often minority communities, younger people, vulnerable people, poorer people, that move more often their address that is on file won't have caught up with voter registration. So they have to register to vote on their current address. Normally there's a big outreach effort. You see people at Heinen's signing. We can't really do that during the pandemic as much. And so voter registration is way down. We have to find ways to reach people to make sure that they are registering to vote. You can register online. You can download forms and send them in. Erika and her organization are working hard to get people registered and get information to people. And the Cleveland Cavaliers have recently announced that they are part of a big voter mobilization effort that includes support of National Voter Registration Day. That's step one. And then everybody who's registered to vote, Secretary of State Frank LaRose is going to send an application for a ballot by mail to every person that is registered to vote. And so we got to get people registered. Then two, they need to vote in one of three ways. And we have to make sure all three ways are accessible to people. This is part of our policy. One, voting by mail, or as Steve called it, I know Erika's called it, voting at home, is the safest way to vote. And Secretary LaRose in his statement today talked about how vote by mail is going to be safe and secure. There is no, we looked and studied, there's no elevated instance of voter fraud. There's no risk that ballots are handled securely. And there is no risk to you, to election workers, to your community if you vote at home. And by the way, then you got all the information in front of you too. You can figure it out. You're not standing at a polling place. It also frees you up to volunteer later on. So the second way to vote is there'll be a month of early voting at the Board of Elections. And our policy statement talks about supporting that. And that is another way to go where you can time it out so that you can be more socially distant. There is also a drop box at the Board of Elections where you can drop a vote by mail. If you don't want to put it in the mail, you can actually physically put it in that drop box. Our policy statement did call for additional drop boxes throughout the community. Secretary of State LaRose announced today in a directive that they're not going to permit additional boxes during, for ballot drop. But we're not going to get all the things called for in our policy. The key is that we keep pushing and promoting ways to vote during the pandemic, and there are plenty of ways to vote early. And then on election day, making sure that polling places people are able to vote in person is extraordinarily important. And I really want to double and triple and quadruple down on the idea that we need younger people to be poll workers. We were talking to the director of the Board of Elections, Tony Perlotti. He says he needs 4,000 poll workers to be able to operate all the polls on election day. And older people who are more at risk from COVID, who often work on polling and do unbelievably long work in these days, who work on polling places, should not be put in that position. We need younger people to be there to take those roles. If you're a lawyer, you can get CLE credit for doing it. You can get 2 years of CLE credit for doing it, given the hours that it takes. And that is something that I think we need to promote. The final thing I will say is it's related to information and related to communication. One of the things we can do is make sure that everybody has accurate information about the 3 ways to vote. Everybody has accurate information that the voter registration deadline is October 5th. We need to get everybody registered by then, that knows the hours the polls are open. And also, and this is sort of a key thing, with an expanded vote by mail that's going to be expected to be multiples time the usual. And by the way, Ohio is has always been a no excuse vote by mail state, meaning you don't need to have a specific excuse to get an absentee ballot. We have an experience with, if you want to vote by mail, you can. So we have an advantage in Ohio. They know how to do it. It's going to be expanded. What I will urge everybody, apply early to vote by mail, send in your vote by mail early. If it is there, it'll be tabulated ahead of time and then counted on election night. But if you get it in right before election day, that's okay. It just will be counted later. So we need to set an expectation that the result on election night might not be the final result, because there could be an expanded number of ballots still after being counted that are coming in by mail. It might not matter for the presidential election, but we know all these smaller elections, local elections with smaller margins, really could be impacted. So some of that will depend, and we had a big part of our policy that was about how we communicate, how we set an expectation of that. And the last thing I will say is I was profoundly moved by the commitment of the Federation and of the Jewish community to this process of voting, as exemplified by the bipartisan support, across the board support for our voting policy. And it really made me proud to be here, home, and part of this community. And I look forward to taking questions and helping and urging. We will all continue to urge people to do their part and volunteer and be poll workers, and make sure your community knows about their right to vote.
Jeremy, thank you. And thank you for the work, your leadership with the task force. You took a very challenging task, and you all did an outstanding job. For the attendees, if you would like more information about the results of the task force, go to jewishcleveland.org, or you can look for the article that was written on clevelandjewishnews.com covering those recommendations. You also mentioned Ohio Secretary of State. We did reach out to the Secretary, Secretary Frank LaRose, who submitted the following statement to be read at this event. This spring, Ohio became the first state to transition an election in response to the global pandemic. This created many challenges, but Ohio's elections officials did what was necessary to protect health and safety and preserve the rights of voters. Along the way, we learned valuable lessons, which led Secretary LaRose to propose several small changes to current election law that he believed would make big improvements in the future. His Ready for November proposal included provisions allowing voters to request their absentee ballot online, using federal dollars to pay postage on all elections mail, and empowering county boards of election to strengthen infrastructure and increase poll recruitment. Many of these ideas are pending in the legislature, where they have bipartisan support from members in the Ohio Association of Elections Officials. Others are currently being implemented as Ohio prepares for the general election. Ohioans have traditionally enjoyed a set of convenient choices for how they can cast a ballot, including 4 weeks of early in-person voting, absentee voting, and voting on election day at a convenient neighborhood location. These choices will not change, and all registered voters will receive an absentee ballot request form in the mail in a few weeks. Our state is a national leader in voter convenience and election integrity, and it will continue to be, but we can always improve. That was from Secretary of State Frank LaRose. And the Secretary mentions some of the pending legislation. Will the panel, and maybe Erika, this might be most appropriate for you, but I'll allow anyone to chime in. Can you give us an update on some of the key election-related legislation that's out there, in particular HB 680 and SB 191?
Sure, thank you, Brad. So, to say that this has been an interesting year would be the understatement of the year on so many different fronts, on a personal level. And I say that, for all of us, whether folks have been directly impacted by COVID or not, we all share, unfortunately, this badge of living through this global pandemic. So I say that because, I think contextualizing this conversation around how to ensure we have fair and equitable elections was the case before COVID. Now we layer in this global pandemic and all that we have seen happen this year. It has made it that much more difficult. At the beginning, Brad said that I eat obstacles for lunch. I will say that my plate runneth over. No more, no more. The mountain of obstacles has been challenging, but I will say that I am also inspired. I have seen just amazing innovation and creativity from activists and advocates across the state, but particularly here in the greater Cleveland area, really showing up to make sure that our residents have access to the vote. But where we stand now, specifically with HB 680 and Senate Bill 191, the challenge is, so we are officially in recess. House Bill 680 did pass out of the House back in June of this year, and it was referred to the Senate Government Oversight and Reform Committee. There was one hearing for that sub-bill for 680 that was held just a couple weeks ago on July 21st. I know Jeremy on the panel this evening and many others provided testimony, providing recommendations to make improvements there. But there are no hearings scheduled for the Senate until at least September, as of right now. And I have been saying this often this year, is that what I'm saying to you right now is the best information I have as I am before you, because we could close out this Zoom and there could be some announcement that could change that. But as of right now, the best information I have is that the last hearing was held on July 21st, and the next scheduled Senate committee hearings are not slated until September. As it pertains to Senate Bill 191, this was initially introduced back actually in September of 2019. It also currently sits with the Senate Government Oversight and Reform Committee, and its last hearing was at the end of February of this year. So we don't have much information beyond that, and we don't foresee that there will be additional hearings. And I welcome, of course, the feedback of my fellow panelists if they have additional information. Jeremy alluded to it, and I would recommend for folks to check out, Secretary LaRose did host a press conference today. If you go to his website, it's the first press release under the news for today, where he lays out the 48 point guidance requirements and recommendations for all county boards of elections. And this is an update to a directive that he provided to all boards of elections back in early July, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll just share some of the high points. Really, obviously, the crux of this is about safety and creating safe conditions for voters. So that's everything from routine cleaning of the voting machines and the e-poll books, mask requirements and regular hand washing for poll workers, putting provisions in around social distancing and recommendations there, as well as making available curbside voting for those that may be unable physically to enter into a polling location or choose not to for reasons that they may specify, making available curbside voting.
So before I pass this to the other two panelists, for the attendees, some of you have already noticed, instead of the little file cards that we normally would pass out in person, if you go to the bottom of your screen, maybe you have to move your cursor around a little bit, it'll open up some options at the bottom of your screen. There's a box for Q&A. If you just click on there and go ahead and type in your question, the question will be privately delivered to our staff that will then hand me those virtual cards. And so go ahead and keep those questions coming in. I will ask you also, or remind you that this is a nonpartisan event. And so please frame your questions in a nonpartisan way so that we can make sure we get your question answered.
Can I follow up on that last answer that Erika gave also?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So I think we all remember what happened on primary night in this election. To be charitable, it was a difficult situation. COVID was new or newer back then, but within a 12-hour period, we went through having an election, we're not having an election, we are having an election, we're not having an election, we think we're having an election, we don't know. And that's not ideal. I had great hope after that night that we would learn some hard lessons and use the time between now and then to actually expand and make more available some of the abilities and access to vote. I really did have high hopes. I think it, again, could be a bipartisan issue. I guess what I would say, Brad, is since then I have been fairly disappointed. And I guess what I would say is, in terms of the right to vote, I hate to say this, but in this election, I think the best thing that I heard is that the legislature's in recess, so they can do no harm and not make things worse. And I think, we're at a point where we have to focus on what the rules are right now. Evidently, something as simple as putting out another drop box is no longer allowed. Fine, then we have to know what's available and then use the access that's available and focus on that. And nobody in this country, as President Obama said, has an excuse not to vote. We all need to vote. I had hoped that in the time of COVID, we could unify around things. I'm not confident we will. So I think we ought to focus on, what's available now. There is time for people to vote at home, to early vote. They ought to focus on getting those applications in. They're going to be sent out. They ought to exercise, however they vote, they ought to exercise that right to vote. And so that's, I guess, unfortunately, where I think we are on the policy front right now.
Thank you, Steve. And Brad, if I may, I just want to concur and just also, I see a couple questions in the chat asking about the contents of these respective bills. I think one of the largest challenges we experienced, there were many, but one of the largest challenges we experienced in the primary was confusion about what people were to do. People just felt like their hands were tied. They did not know, am I showing up? Am I not showing up? Am I completing this application? Am I not completing this application? And I think we have to be very cautious that, across Ohio, we have various levels of understanding and education as it pertains to the granular nature of legislative bills, and that can cause confusion. We have great organizations like All Voting is Local and many others who really try to provide fact-based information about, bills and information so folks know. But I really appreciate, Steve, your point about like what we have is what we have. And that's not saying that I'm not recommending for folks to activate and advocate, but we have, we have very little time before this election. So just being cognizant about, where's the window of advocacy versus like where we need to just act and make sure that what we have available to us today is as most accessible as we can possibly make it, and make sure that people understand what that information is. Because I was getting calls on April 25th and people were pleading with me for me to get their ballot. And I'm like, I am so sorry, right? I have no authority, no legal authority whatsoever to provide that. So the misinformation that, is just ingrained in this work for no particular party, but just this work. But the confusion is probably one of the biggest challenges we saw during the primary, along many others.
I wanted to sort of radically agree with Steve and Erika around this notion, because there's a lot of questions in the chat box that relate to advocacy strategy. Is it too late to push back on the one ballot box? Is it too late to do changes? First of all, it's never too late to advocate. I think that the purpose of advocating is not necessarily to achieve a change in that particular decision, but to influence other decisions around the core principle of we really have to make it able for our friends and neighbors to vote during the pandemic. There are a bunch of other decisions that are within the Secretary of State's purview via directives to the boards of election, that are within the Board of Elections purview about how they interpret and enact those things. So yes, advocate, use your voice. But I really want to radically agree with the idea of we need to roll with what we have. That there are certain things that I take a lot of comfort in that Secretary of State LaRose said today in his press conference. One of them, this also addresses a question we're seeing in the chat about vote by mail. If you are following the news, there is an alarming effort to undercut the post office that is underway, and concerns about the post office slowing down and mail slowing down. I don't want people to be so alarmed that they don't utilize this tool of voting by mail. I think it's one of those things where it's like, no, just give me a long line. Get to the Browns game an hour early, right? I mean, you don't wait till 10 minutes before kickoff to go in. If you know you're going to vote by mail, vote earlier. Urge other people to vote earlier. It's a very safe and secure way to do it. So I think I would go ahead and vote by mail if you can. If you're right up against election day and you haven't voted by mail, I would show up early and drop your ballot at the Board of Elections or vote at Board of Elections. And if you haven't done that, I would vote a regular ballot on election day. But you can do it early. So I think using the tools. The last thing I'll say on this is I think communication is one of the huge challenges here. There's a lot of misinformation that's purposeful, and then there's also just a lot of information confusion out there. So this is why one of the reasons I'm so excited about Erika and I have been in a lot of conversations with the Cleveland Cavaliers that announced that they're making this big push on voting the other sports teams. The more people that are out there pushing people to remind them to update their voter registration. Here are the deadlines. And somebody put in the chat, it's October 5th is the deadline to register to vote. That is when the early vote window then opens. And you need to be registered with your accurate address by then. And so knowing those things and reaching out to the various communities you're in touch with are just going to be so valuable. Yes, advocate, but also activate, right? As Erika said, and get moving with it. We should not feel paralyzed in the face of challenge. We should feel animated to do something about it.
So a number of the questions that are coming out are around the formalities of attendees asking how they go about these process. There's lots of wonderful resources out there on the internet. The one concise place that I found just sort of everything that you would want to know is voteohio.gov. So voteohio.gov has a number of just little boxes to check on if you want to be a poll worker, if you want to know the schedule of when you have to have things done. There's a number of very good resources and nonpartisan resources that are out there. I do want to ask you all, though, because as I was digesting information in preparation for tonight, I believe in everything that you've talked about. I believe in everything that Jeremy and the task force put together, and everything that Erika's organization is doing. But there were a couple of things that were troubling me, and I wanted to get your opinion on them. First of all, I want to keep this completely nonpartisan. So let's forget about the question of whether there's fraud in voting and those partisan topics. But the facts are there's approximately 160 million people that are expected to vote in the upcoming election. And across the board, we've had other states that have had mail-in or absentee voting for years, many of them very successfully. But even the very successful ones have about a 1% rejection rate of those mail-in ballots. Generally, for just procedural issues, it may be that the person didn't sign. It was a legitimate submission, but the person didn't sign, or there was a mismatch. I signed my name on something for the first time in months today, and I couldn't read my signature. And so with a 1% rejection rate, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of legitimate votes that aren't tallied. How is that okay?
It's not. I think you bring up a good point. And I will tell you that this is something, it's not just mail-in, it's in-person voting that this happens in too. In Ohio, I think one of the things, in Ohio, when you vote on election day, there's this everywhere, but in Ohio, like other places, you can vote provisionally, right? Which is this idea that you can vote because we haven't sort of figured it out yet, and we'll figure out whether the vote really counts later in some process after the election. And for years, in doing election protection work, I have been troubled at the provisional voting rates in Ohio. They are higher than in our brother and sister states. And we need to do a better job of creating a culture where the presumption is that valid votes count. Now you mentioned the idea of voter fraud, and I want to gently.
I do want to keep it nonpartisan, though. So
right, but I gently want to push back on the idea that like climate change, that voter fraud is a partisan issue. There are facts. The facts are that I was a chief federal law enforcement officer for 6 million people for 7 years. There was not a single instance of a federal case involving voter fraud during that time, during the time in this administration, during the prior administration, or the administration before that. From both parties, secretaries of state, including the last secretary of state, repeatedly said that we don't have a voter fraud issue. And so I don't care what party you're from, facts are facts. And Brad, the reason I bring this up is because this is the justification that is used to reject ballots. This is the justification that is used to force people to vote provisionally. And so it is relevant to our conversation. And as I said before, to me, these remedies, these sort of barriers, are solutions in search of a problem that doesn't exist. And that's why I bring it up, not because I care who said what. I just want people to know that is not, the data just simply don't support that there's an issue other than isolated cases of this going on. And so you're right, it's not okay to reject legitimate ballots like that. And part of that is sort of a historical and cultural issue that we have to get, that really didn't exist in this country for several decades. It did before that, right, in the South in the 60s and 50s, and we have to get away from that.
Brad, you ask a really interesting question, which is at the core of our commitment to democracy. I think that voting should be massively easier than it is. That the entire process of registration is actually a problematic process that you don't have in other democracies. And you could, there's some states have automatic voter registration or same-day voter registration. These are all things that are really worth thinking about. They were not the subject of our particular task force for the Federation. It was really about during the pandemic, how do we do with voting? But I also want to highlight something that's really important to think about as the Jewish community is a minority community. Other minority communities in Cleveland and throughout the country really bear the brunt of a lot of the challenges of voting. And especially at a time when we are really wrestling with racial injustice in this country, it is so powerful. And it is such an important thing to make sure that everybody can vote. And so one of the things that is at the heart of, I think, our policy statement, our advocacy, and our work in this panel is how do we help and make sure that everybody in our community is able to vote, that everybody gets the right information, that communities that are most impacted by these challenges, that we offset them, we work to combat them. So I really do think of it, and I think our task force thought of this in a very nonpartisan, values-oriented way. I also, as Steve knows, I really agree with him. I worked on the Voting Rights Act reauthorization. I've had a career in voting rights, but I think what's great is the framework here is that we can help each other. And I know, Erika, your organization is focused on underserved communities and reaching communities that need, I mean, there are some things that like, you know, when you start to get to the ground, people are asking all these questions, how can you help? What can I do? Erika has a program, Masks for Communities, which is that people that are doing the process of hanging, providing information about where to register to vote in communities, people that don't have access to the internet, aren't living online, that need the access. If you're going door to door these days, that can be a risk. Everybody's on masks. So these Masks for Communities, Erika put out a call. We were on a call with the Cavs. The next day they were out there, that Larry Nance Jr. was out there, right? Handing. So these are kind of everyday actions that really get to the neighborhood by neighborhood nature of voting. And by the way, this is a problem in every election, an issue in every election, but it is so much more acute right now. So I think there's a lot of questions about like what can I do granularly to help. I know Erika. I know I'm taking Brad's role here, but I would love to hear some of the things in your toolkit as you're looking at like that. What can you do to help? What can we, like, there's a lot of nature of that question. How can I serve and help my neighbors?
Erika, the moderator, has asked you a question.
Brad knows, I was always going to step over. Now I'll shut up.
Go ahead, Erika. Thank you.
I did want to just quickly direct folks. So I said earlier that the Secretary of State came out with his 48-point plan today, very specifically in Directive 2020-11, Part 6, is detail pertaining to how to rectify this issue when there's not accurate information, and the ways in which that the Board of Election is being directed to try to get that information. I will say specifically for Cuyahoga County, it may seem small, but it is huge when you're conducting voter registration. Our required fields are highlighted, and I'm pretty sure we're the only county out of all 88 counties. And again, that might seem small, but when you are in a crowd, again, this is pre-COVID, when we're out and about, and you're registering a bunch of people, being able to say to them, make sure you fill out all those yellow fields is really critical. And I'll say, as a practitioner, we just had an event this weekend, a day of action, and I was entering the data into our database, and thankfully my husband's a teacher, because I was like, oh my God, like, what does this name say? Like, who is this person? Like, I don't understand. So, as someone who hosts events and does that, we often do like to actually write the information, but because of COVID, we're not doing that, right? And because we're trying to create distance and not touch the same thing. So, but pre-COVID, we would be the ones to actually write the person's information on that voter registration card or on that vote by mail application for that very reason, to make sure that it was legible, and we mitigated and reduced, that's all we could do, the likelihood of there being an error. But I think Jeremy just dropped Cleveland Vote's toolkit into the chat. This is something that we just released this week. And really it's a compilation of, work that we've done over the last couple of years. Many of the strategies and the tactics that we highlight in our toolkit, many of those came just from the primary. We were forced into this creative space of trying to figure out how to maintain the health and safety of ourselves and our partners, but still accessing and getting information to the constituents in our community. So I'll just very quickly kind of highlight some of the elements of that toolkit. One thing we really encourage, and this is both for individuals as well as organization, is always starting with your assets, right? We all have assets at our disposal, and really thinking about what you have. Are you someone who's on Twitter or on the TikTok? I use the kids' terms. Who has like a wide base of individuals that might be following you. Are you part of an association with your faith-based institution, or maybe like a women's affiliated group, or whatever the association is? It's like, what do I actually have around me right now? I have myself, I may have family, I may have friends. It's like kind of think about this nucleus and you're kind of building it out. I have coworkers, I have, my neighbors, think about what is at your disposal right now and how you can access those assets that you have. And what we often say is don't assume everybody hip. Like, don't assume, right? Just because they're your family member or they're your friend or they're your colleague, don't assume that everybody knows this information. And I will say there's vulnerability here. People get nervous to ask these questions because they feel like they're lesser than, like, oh shoot, like I'm not gonna ask Erika that question because I should know this answer. I should know how to register to vote or where to register to vote or what the deadline is. So, just being empathetic to people's vulnerabilities of like why they may or may not want to ask that question to make it casual. So I'm sure many of you have had over these last couple of months, Zoom happy hours, various socially distanced engagements. Like, it doesn't have to be like doom and gloom, be that person at the barbecue. I'm that person at the barbecue. I'm the one that brings, voter registrations to the July 4th barbecue. I'm not necessarily suggesting that, but just think about your own networks, your own assets. Again, if you work for an organization, how can you leverage your website? How can you leverage your newsletter? Social media, obviously, minimizing our contact with people. So really elevating and using our social media as a means to communicate, but we know that can't be the only route. We have a real problem in Cleveland about digital redlining. So we have parts of our community that have low broadband access. So we can't only rely upon social media and communicating information that way. We have to also do it old school. And doing it old school is like thinking about different multimedia partners, right? Whether that's local journalism, some communities have like a block-based like newsletter or a paper. I live in the Old Brooklyn neighborhood. I asked the executive director of the CDC here, like, hey, can you put some information in the newsletter that you put out or in the booklet that comes out every couple of months? So thinking at that granular level, as well as obviously radio, TV, things of that nature, if you have the ability and the resources to do that. I think the main and really exciting thing that we've seen this year is like folks adapting with these in-person strategies. What we say first and foremost, from a value standpoint, we're not going to ask anybody to do anything that we don't feel is safe, period. And this is a very serious pandemic. I'm not going to put myself at risk as much as I might eat obstacles for lunch. I also value my life. I value the life of my family and my friends. So I have to stay safe, and we encourage the same for others. But what we have seen is just amazingness of people doing voter drive-ups, voter drives. We have folks on the west side of Cleveland have done these caravanas where they're literally driving around neighborhoods and handing out vote by mail applications, and then they're swinging back around and they're getting those vote by mail applications, because we know that having a stamp for that application can be a barrier. So that's one way to mitigate that they've done. We have National Voter Registration Day coming up in September. We work with the Board of Election here in Cuyahoga County to organize events. Last year, I think we had 50 some odd events happening all throughout the greater Cleveland area on NVRD. Many of those are going to now be digitally, but we're still going to make it fun and exciting. And then also education, right? We need to know, so after we do all we need to do, after we register, after we check our registration, after we request our vote by mail, after we have our voting plan, we actually know like what's on the ballot, right? So we have to access voter guides. So we produce a voter guide. We highly recommend the League of Women Voters, Vote 411. There's a plethora of different judicial voter guides that come out, some more local-based municipal voter guides that come out. And these are all obviously nonpartisan. So any way that you can share that. I will say, as someone who does like to go to the polls, the primary was my first time voting at home in all the years that I've been voting. And I will say, I didn't want to admit it, but I will say that it was actually nice to be able to sit here at my desk with my computer and my ballot and just like have the information readily available to me and not have to like scramble and make sure I had it all in my head before I went down to the poll. So I've been an avid in-person voter, but I think team vote from home may have won me because it was really, really helpful and felt a little bit less stressful having that information in front of me.
I have a comment and a quick question. The comment is,
if you can keep it brief though.
Yep. The comment is when we say vote, make sure you vote down the ballot. So there's a lot of elections that are very important. So vote down the ballot. Vote in all of the elections. Then the question is, I'll be the one to ask the stupid question. It's my role in life. You said there's no such thing as that. So somebody has said, well, what are the dates? What are the deadlines? What are the dates for this group so that they have the real information about what deadlines are facing them?
Sure, I can go. So the voter registration deadline is October 5th. Early voting begins on October 6th. And if you live in Cuyahoga County, that takes place at the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, which is located at 2925 Euclid Avenue. You can access that from East 30th, from either Euclid or Chester Avenue. That is the only location for early voting that you are able to go to conduct and cast your ballot. The deadline for applications for vote by mail is October 31st. I have to throw in also census, just in case folks have not completed their census. That's actually September 30th. Early voting will end on November 2nd, and the election day is November 3rd.
And all of that information, number one, Jeremy has posted a couple of those links in the chat. And then all of that information is very easily accessible at www.voteohio.gov. And so we'll mention that again, but voteohio.gov. A couple of the questions in there, I'll address quickly. Some people had questions about the voter fraud. I would, again, just turn you to the internet. In this case, it's actually quite easy to research. There is a very small, de minimis amount of fraud. Even those that are strong advocates that this is a fraudulent process, just search for the list of all the cases, and then you can find all the cases that are being identified as potentially fraudulent, and you can decide if that's a meaningful piece for you. A lot of questions are coming out about the post office. And so we're going to we always have a substantial amount of mail-in ballots. I think we had 25% were mail-in in the last election, and there'll probably be more like 50% is anticipated this election. And so just very briefly, is the post office ready for that? And then are there ways that we can assist with that? Can we gather those ballots and deliver them? Can we go to an apartment building and pick up all the ballots for everybody and deliver them? Or can we buy stamps? Is there a way for us to help facilitate or circumvent the post office?
I'll answer the one quick part, and then I don't know, Erika or Steve can go with the specifics on that, which is, I mean, I said this before, I think we should count on being able to vote by mail. I would vote earlier. I would vote as early as I can and get the ballot in and not have the rush, not wait till the deadline, make sure that my ballot gets in on time. I think I would just be prudent given the situation in the world and with the post office. We should absolutely be advocating for change at the federal level with that. It's an atrocity. Such is life right now. I would still count on being able to vote by mail. Erika or Steve, I think those are really critical short questions about how can we help? I think you cannot pick up people's ballots and dock them. I think people have to drop them for themselves or mail them themselves. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so I would say, one, create a voting plan that makes sense for you, yourself, your family. We want people to ultimately be comfortable and feel like their choice is the safest choice. What you can do to mitigate the delays with potential post office is request your ballot as soon as you click off Zoom tonight. Get that application. If you have a printer at home, I highly encourage you to print it out. You can drop it off to the Board of Elections, to the safe and secure box in their parking lot. If you don't have a printer, Secretary of State has said this, so I'm going to trust that this is right. You can take a blank piece of paper. You can look at the fields on that application and write that same information on a blank piece of paper to request your ballot. You can also call your local Board of Election to request your ballot. What we need folks to do is to flatten the ballot curve. So we've heard a lot about flatten the curve for COVID. We need you to flatten the ballot curve. If we all wait to the end of September and like, oh snap, there's an election, I should request my ballot, I don't want to go to the polls, we will be in a really dire situation. So we need folks to plan now. It's August 12th. You can print out that application, request your ballot. The Secretary of State As was said earlier, we'll be sending the application, so the absentee application, to all registered voters, which is about 7.8 in Ohio, around Labor Day. So you could wait, or you can just do it now. Literally hang up the Zoom and go to the Secretary of State's website or to the Cuyahoga County Board of Election. As it pertains to you dropping off other people's ballots, you can drop off the application to the Board of Election. Again, you can do that by just using the drop box in the parking lot, or during the hours that they're open in the actual physical building. The application. You cannot
Erika?
drop.
Erika, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm going to leave the procedures to, that information is great online. Again, voteohio.gov and many other resources, including, Erika, will you give us your website so that we have that as well?
Oh, sure. It's CLE votes, VOTES.com, CLEvotes.com.
So CLEvotes.com. Also, we'll have the timeline, the procedures, where to go through there, so that you don't have to furiously write this down. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are at the hour. And first of all, I want to thank our three just outstanding panelists. Erika, Jeremy, Steve, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. I also want to thank AJC and the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, the co-sponsors of tonight's event, along with Jewish Federation. The partnership that we've had with you for years has been wonderful. This is just another example of us working together to serve the community. We hope that you'll leave this event tonight with three primary takeaways that you can do to ensure a safe and accessible elections. These are topics that the panelists discussed tonight. Number one, ensure you and your friends and family are registered to vote by October 5th, and encourage others to do it as well. The good news is that the Secretary of State has made sure that no voter registrations will expire prior to the November election, and that voting in the 2020 election will make you once again an active voter, so that you don't have to re-register after this one. So that was a concern early on that's been responded to. If you need to register or check your registration, go to voteohio.gov. You need to request a ballot and vote by mail early. I love that line, flatten the ballot curve. That's exactly what needs to be done to protect the rights of voters and to ease the burden on the post office. Again, to request a ballot and vote by mail, go to voteohio.gov. Encourage the young adults in your life to serve as poll workers. I am not a young adult, but I am young enough that I can serve. And so just this week, I went to go register to be a poll worker. In case you're wondering where you can do that, that's right. It's voteohio.gov. It's right on that website also. And one thing that I would encourage you all to do is, if you're able to, check the box on there to say that you're willing to travel to a more distant polling location, so that the resources can be spread across the community as needed. But please register, reach out to people that are able to get out in this environment and serve in a long day, but a very rewarding day to serve as a poll worker. If we all work together, we can make a true difference in this unprecedented year. Erika is making a huge difference in all the work that she and her organization are doing. Jeremy and the task force have made a huge impact on the Jewish community with the response from your task force, and Steve has always been dedicated to this work. And so we have two important announcements before I let you go. First, once again, I want to thank our incredible panel, Erika Anthony, Steve Dettelbach, and Jeremy Paris. Thank you for all that you do to preserve democracy and for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. Second, I hope you will join the Federation, AJC, and the Maltz Museum for Jewish Heritage for 2 additional panels on important issues facing our country. Please save September 15th for a discussion on faith in a time of crisis, which will feature 3 local clergy. And please save October 12th for a conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Wesley Lowery. So September 15th, October 12th, you'll be receiving emails. Finally, we hope that you've truly enjoyed this program tonight, but we all know why we all come to Federation events in the evening. It is for the information, but truly it's for the dessert reception. And so we want to all get together now for a nosh and a kibitz, as we would if we were meeting at Federation or another location. So I want everyone to grab a nosh to run out to their pantry. I went over and Jeremy has a little bourbon over there. I'm more for the calories, so I went for some coconut bars. So please go grab yourself a beverage and something to eat. We'll meet back here in about 5 minutes. If you look in the chat window, I hope, if you look in the chat window, there is a link to the reception that was just distributed. So you just click on, actually, I don't see that link yet. Is it there? So Aaron, if you'll put that link out in the, there we go. Wow, that's amazing. Technology works. Aaron just put out a link to have a connection to the lobby. We'll go out and we'll chat as a group out in the lobby, and then we'll be divided into smaller groups where we can continue the conversation with the panelists.